what is a marvelous book, Inside the Deal, How the EU Got Brexit Done. My name is Brigid Laffan. I'm an emeritus professor of the European University Institute in Florence. And we have a wonderful panel. The author, Stefaan de Rynck, the insider view of these negotiations, Katrin Pribyl, who's a journalist who will give us a journalistic view of the differences between the press in the United Kingdom and in Europe, and Dr Nicholas Startin, who will give us an academic view. This is a very important story because on the Friday after the referendum, as overnight it became clear that the first state was going to leave the EU, there was genuine shock, although the prospect of a no vote had been factored in, but there was still shock that for the first time ever in the history of European integration, a country was going to leave the EU. And there were real fears at the time that this would be the start of something, a domino effect leading to other exits, or a disintegrative dynamic that would take the EU down. And there was a lot of uncertainty on that Friday, but very quickly, the speed with which the EU framed what Brexit meant to it and how it intended to handle it, it was literally from that Friday to a European Council within 10 days. And from then, Brexit was regarded as a shock to the EU system, as something that the EU deeply regretted, but respected and accepted the outcome of the vote. But, and this was the trick, the exit of the United Kingdom, the referendum result was an endogenous shock to the EU. It was an internal shock by a member state, from a member state. And within a very short period of time, by the European Council conclusions, the EU had classified the United Kingdom as a third country in the making. In other words, it was on the platform, on the way out, exit. And that altered the shock to the EU system from an endogenous shock within the system to an exogenous shock. The UK was being shunted onto tracks and was going to exit by those tracks. And I think this Stefan's book has done a wonderful job in capturing the dynamic of the negotiations, the detail of the negotiations, the ups and downs, but also the personalities of the negotiations. And I'm also delighted that he's an alumnus of the European University Institute. So he got all of his great academic training in Florence, and it shows in this book. It's extraordinarily readable, and it's a wonderful complement to Michel Barnier's book, much more detailed in terms of its content. So I look forward very much to our discussion. We'll hear in turn from our three speakers, and then we'll open to the floor. And I look forward to a very rich discussion. So Stefan, the floor is yours, either from there or here, whichever suits you.
I'll maybe go there first. And the only thing I need is my little.
Oh.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Brigid, for that kind introduction. And thank you, Katrin and Nick, for taking the time. Busy day at the European Council. So, I'm speaking tonight. I have to repeat this every time I do a book launch, but in my personal capacity as an author. So I'm also an official at the EU, but I don't speak in that capacity. I also no longer work on EU-UK matters, but we have enough to talk about, I think, if you just stick to the period of the book, and maybe in the discussion with Nick and Katrin, we can also look a bit at today. I mean, if I can, the book for a second, I wanted to start with the subtitle, perhaps. And in the introduction, I describe a number of fallacies that I describe from the UK's perspective. And the subtitle of the book is How the EU Got Brexit Done. And I was in London for a few book launches, and people said, oh, is this some venom against Boris Johnson or something? Because of course, that was Boris Johnson's electoral slogan for December 2019, get Brexit done, which came after 2.5 years of volatility in British politics, paralysis, stalemate, and he won that election decisively. With apologies for the people who are on the live stream, you won't maybe see this clearly enough, but this is the bulldozer that Boris Johnson drives through the wall to get Brexit done. These are the boxing gloves that he has to get Brexit done. So that was really the slogan that convinced also some people on the Remain side to vote for him, actually, research showed, because people were really fed up that Brexit hadn't been done, at least some people on the Remain side. And I used it for the subtitle, how the EU got Brexit done, because we were sometimes accused by people on the Brexit side that we were trying to sabotage Brexit during these negotiations, especially when we said no to the UK, especially when the negotiations went into stalemate and paralysis and not much happened. People on the Brexit side of the argument says, look how difficult they are. And of course, they want us to vote again. They want to keep us in the EU. A historian, Robert Toms, Cambridge University professor, wrote that, of course, they always ask you to vote again until the EU vote in the way the Brussels wants you to vote. And we wanted to get Brexit done, even though we regretted Brexit, but we wanted that deal. And as Barnier often said, you don't need a negotiator for no deal. So that was, for me, already one of the first, or that's an introduction. I speak of a number of fallacies. And for me, that's one of the fallacies that on the Brexit side in the UK, that shows how the Brexit story is a very different story in Brussels from the story that was told in London. And that's indeed part of the book. Also, people on the Remain side, I must say, you'll need to buy the book to see what Barnier and Tony Blair discussed, but there was an underlying assumption in that conversation that in the end, the EU would somehow find a way to accommodate UK, Brexit, Britain, no longer Brexit, but with some kind of special deal. And that, of course, never happened. I actually remember, Brigid, we discussed Brexit in October, November 16 in Florence, and you invited a number of British academics and a number of EU academics, and I was privileged to be part of that. And already back then, you could feel that the story was interpreted very differently from the EU academics compared to the most of the British academics, I would say, that were present at that seminar you organized there. A second fallacy that I describe is that there seems to be, in some parts of the UK, an addiction to confrontation with the EU and a need for confrontation with the EU as a negotiation style. In the media, for sure, but also statements by some of the ministers at the time, comparing this to a fist fight, perhaps, or like a poker game where there's ultimately one winner that takes it all. And my thesis there on negotiations is that this is actually something that worked to the detriment of the UK. Because in a negotiation, it's not about beating the other party. It's not about rejecting what the other party asks from you. It's basically about offering something to the other party if you want to gain influence, something the other party values. And when I describe the way David Frost and Boris Johnson tackled these negotiations in 2020, they denied any discussion on the core demands of the EU, which was level playing field. Level playing field meaning how will the UK and the EU uphold certain social environmental standards, not have unfair competition in terms of trading relationships? How will there be avoiding of distorting state subsidies to companies and so on? And Frost refused for 6-7 months to talk even about most of these issues. And if the experts talked about it, then politically there was backtracking on what had been discussed. And instead, the UK, certainly at that time, issued repeatedly no deal threats. We'll walk away by the end of June if there's no outline of an agreement. We'll walk away by the end of August. We'll walk away in September. We'll walk away by the October European Council. If the Europeans don't move, the European Council said, hey, UK, it's time for you to move. And then there was a whole political drama. And the UK came back. And so these no deal threats didn't really help the credibility, I would say, this confrontational style, but also didn't really make any material difference for us as negotiators. And that's something we can perhaps then discuss in terms of the unity of the 27 and how we had the luxury of being patient, also backed by 27 united governments, I think, in these negotiations. So that's the second point. I think confrontation and negotiation is not a very productive approach in my view, and it is the approach that mostly was practiced by the UK. One key exception, I would argue, is how Theresa May engaged with us on the construction of the Northern Irish backstop, which was a UK-wide customs union that the UK as a whole state in the customs union with the EU to avoid a hard border on the island of Ireland, basically. And so to basically do the border check somewhere else, but to avoid that these would be so intense, she had agreed that the UK as a whole would stay in the customs union. And when that, she constructed that with us, I would argue that this is a give and take, quite concession on our side, which in the UK led to an outcry of the Europeans have trapped us in their regulatory and customs orbit, and this is basically unacceptable. At least some part of the Conservative Party argued that. A third fallacy, and I'll finish with that one in terms of fallacies, is that we were inflexible. Now we were, whenever our core negotiation demands were at stake. Integrity of the single market, or freedoms are indivisible, so you don't want for free movement of people, you can't have free movement of goods and services. That was clear. But if you look back at the story, we negotiated two different kinds of Brexit with two different prime ministers. A closer one with Theresa May, a more distant one, a softer or a harder one, as it was called back then, with May versus Johnson. And I think part of this accusation of us being dogmatic and lack of flexibility goes back to what you said, Brigid, by way of introduction. A fundamental misunderstanding in some quarters, at least, of UK government, ministerial level, I would say, by the fact that the decision to do Brexit meant a loss of influence in a club of member states. And you lose influence to shape what that club thinks. By putting yourself outside, you have to bargain with that club, which suddenly is a club that defends its own interests, and where your interest is the interest of an outsider. And I say this as a fallacy because, and this for me is really a surprising element of this story, but it seemed to me that not everyone in Theresa May's government at ministerial level understood that and said, we will just keep trading as before. That's, well, why would it change because of Brexit? And so the fact that a country that puts itself outside of the club is suddenly confronted with a club that defends its own interest in terms of single market integrity seemed to come as a surprise to some, at least. Now, part of the accusation of lack of flexibility was that we did not want to give to Theresa May what she asked from us, frictionless trade outside of the single market and customs union. And from there came that for some of that accusation that we were legalistic and rigid. In the book, I argue that in that sense, it was for us easier to negotiate with Johnson because he accepted, and Frost, they accepted that leaving the single market and the customs union led to trade obstacles that didn't exist before, which is something that Theresa May never wanted to accept. And she was looking for that holy grail of frictionless trade outside of the single market and customs union. So the focus of my book is the unity of the 27 against the backdrop of UK politics, as I kind of briefly gave some headlines for that. And we can talk about that, how it was initially constructed. It wasn't a given. It had to be constructed. It was constructed by EU leaders, post-Euro crisis as well. There was a high sense of we need to avoid yet another risk to, or yet another existential challenge to the European Union. The clarity of our mandate that we co-created with European Union leaders, but that they adopted, the 27, was fundamental for the unity. It was a crystal clear negotiation mandate based on principles rather than engaging in sectorial bargaining. So that was very important. A constant risk by us as a team to manage, a constant attention by us as a team to manage risks to that unity. And Barnier's, I would say, inclusive method, transparency, unprecedented transparency between the Commission and 27 member states. There's some diplomats here who have experience of the Council Working Party or the Working Party UK now. I think we can all look back at, certainly during the negotiations, a period of unprecedented transparency at that time. Let me conclude with one more general remark, which is based on my two events that I had in London this week and last week, basically. Johnson had a subtitle here when Get Brexit Done. I'm not sure if you can see it. No, it's not on it, but the subtitle was Unleashing Britain's Potential. That was 2019. And I found, at least the two debates I had, of course, they're in London, and so they're not representative of the rest of the UK. But there's clear a shift in public opinion in the UK today in terms of the story of Brexit. And there is rather an unleashing potential, which was partly based on this fallacy, the bus that did the tour in 2016. If you look at today's situation, there is a drop in UK tax revenues because of Brexit, and because of leaving the single market. So the money that was sent to Brussels was a good investment because the return was higher. So there is an issue there that the UK need to grapple with. But for me, many people asked me in London, is Brexit really done? And there is still a debate there on, have we done Brexit? Have we deregulated? Have we got rid of the rules that the EU wanted? So that debate is not finished. And on the Remain side, and still people talk today in terms of Remain and Brexit side, which is another indicator that this debate is not finished. On the Remain side, people talk about the negative impacts of the trade and cooperation agreement and what to do to remedy that. And I look at this from Brussels and I don't see that same intensity of debate, obviously. Brexit is not the #1 issue that Brussels is thinking about in terms of EU-UK relations. Of course, it is something that dominates, but the trade and cooperation agreement is there. The withdrawal agreement is there. There are talks going on about Northern Ireland. But that's a different story that brings us then back to today. So I hope the book can be a little bit of a catharsis in terms of looking back at a very difficult period, EU-UK, a very difficult, acrimonious political period. And perhaps by looking back at it and rediscussing all of that, we may come to a more positive environment in terms of more constructive relationship moving forward. So thank you.
Can you hear it?
Live stream.
It's live stream. Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
First of all, thank you very much. I must say, for me, having lived in the UK for almost 8 years from 2014, it makes quite painful reading going through all this. Again, I mean, I find it very interesting because obviously, like, I have followed it rather closely from the UK side. And this whole drama was just a totally different story in London. And we know each other because Stefan, every once in a while, came to London, explained the technical details and about, talked about where we are, what we want, what the rules are. And everyone was always like, what? What is that? Like, hardly anything was totally understood, although we were probably a bit more into detail than our British colleagues, who basically were focused on the political theater and drama of Westminster. But I think that kind of summed it up a bit, that we were sitting there hearing all those details from Stefan, when actually it was all about politics all the time. I do find it, I found it quite interesting how the media in Brussels was almost like a cult, an anti-Brexit, pro-EU cult on the side of the Commission. I don't think that was healthy either. There was so much bitterness in Brussels. At the same time, there was a lot of misunderstandings on both sides, I would say. In London, I thought the level of knowledge was just so little and so low that there was not even the possibility to discuss things properly. And then I think another problem was the approach was very different. Like when, I never understood why the EU didn't sell their concessions a bit better. You could hardly find them when someone from the Commission had a little speech, and it was kind of hard to find what do they give away to London. And I thought that was not very well done. And then, of course, it was all about rules and principles, as you also point out. And I mean, now just, watching it or like observing it as a journalist, I thought, or I didn't understand always fully why doing it like that, why treating Britain by the books when clearly it's not just like any other state. And as we can see now, and as the Commission has said many years ago already, you want to go for a more geopolitical approach, and the EU has to become more powerful also in geopolitics. You sort of like then need Britain. And maybe you can elaborate on that a bit more. Was always wondering why not giving some concessions on the integrity of the single market when you sort of know you need you need Britain for the future when it comes to in security terms. And of course, I understand it was always like not undermining the single market, yet I don't know if maybe a bit of flexibility would have been not too bad. But yeah, in general, for me, it's just like kind of, as a journalist, I guess, we had to deal a lot with expectation management because obviously, like, I mean, I'm from Germany and it's almost like, I would say, there's not one single person, of course, in Germany who would be in favor of Brexit. And so they are like, they just could never understand why would anyone do that. And I think it was more about like, it's not only about economics and it's not only about numbers and and companies and whatever. It's also like politically, it was just always so different to the continent. And I think that was very difficult for many to understand. And doesn't matter on what side you are, but I mean, a lot of people did never feel or never felt very connected in an emotional way to the EU, like in France or in Germany. Okay. But yeah, I kind of like, just as a last point, maybe I remember in 2016 traveling through the UK before the referendum, and I was quite surprised because when like the foreign press, the foreign correspondents based in London would go to Northern Ireland, they would all be like, well, we have not seen so far any British journalists here, when it was already for us quite like a point that this is going to be a big problem. And I thought that was quite interesting, but like that issue only became an issue for the British people and the British press, I think 2 years later in 2018, and everyone was very surprised. But I thought like it was quite shocking how little in detail there was regarding the EU, how little knowledge there was. And I think you can probably tell more because you were in touch with British journalists as well. Anyway, here you go.
Thank you, Nick.
Thanks, folks. It's great to be here in Brussels. I've been researching Euroscepticism since the late 90s, but nothing was quite as dramatic as the morning of the referendum result. I was doing some fact-checking work for BBC Radio Bristol, which I've been doing for about a year in the lead up to the Brexit referendum. And I wasn't surprised by the result, actually. I wrote an article in 2015 which kind of predicted it. But when it actually happened, I think there was a deep state of shock amongst certainly the academic community that I was working in at Bath. I've subsequently relocated to Rome and I'm teaching US students in the beautiful city of Rome. I suspect it's a psychological reaction to Brexit, but maybe that's for another day. Let me just get to the point then. I really enjoyed this book. I think before I start to analyze it, I want to heap some praise on the author. It's a really nice balance, I think, the book. What it does very effectively is to take you through in a kind of chronological way that doesn't feel too chronological, the various steps that finally led to the deal being sealed. There is detail, lots of detail about the policy, a lot of detail about the negotiation, but it's also a really good read. And it's not every day that you get a book that manages to navigate being readable and being serious. So I suspect that the book's got quite a lot of traction beyond just the academic community, the practitioner community and the media community. I suspect that it will, be a success to the wider community in London, Brussels, and elsewhere. So that was just my opening gambit about the book itself. So I'm just going to give you some observations that I draw from the book, some of which have kind of reaffirmed some of the things that I already thought and suspected, and some which I hadn't really thought of, which maybe I will draw attention to as we go along. The first thing I'd like to talk about is really the naivety of the British government. It pains me as a Londoner and a Brit to say that, but the genuine belief that we were in a kind of two-way process here where both sides were on a level playing field, when we've got 27 European Union nation states negotiating with one nation state, which is exiting the EU. And you have that quote that kind of sums it up in the book: the EU needs us more than we need them, that kind of mentality. That's quite difficult to fathom, really. So that's the first thing I want to say. I do think there was a real naivety around how the UK positioned itself, in a kind of belief that it was in a stronger position than it was. The second point I'd like to pick up on is I think the book really reinforces some of the findings that I found from my research, which has been a lot about the impact of the press and the media, particularly the tabloid press, on the Eurosceptic debate in the UK. And that goes back, you can trace that back to Maastricht, but the tabloid papers like the Sun and the Mail and the Express, and also the bigger non-tabloid papers like the Telegraph, almost at the stage where they've got an agenda setting role about the UK's relationship with the European Union, which I'm not sure is an entirely healthy thing for democracy. These publications were influential in forcing the referendum in 2016, and they continue to exert a real hold on the debate about Britain's relationship in the future with the European Union. I noted from the book as well, there appeared to be, a few occasions that you cited, Stefan, when the British government was sort of almost using the press as a way to leak some of the stuff that was going on in the negotiations. Maybe I'm over-egging that, but you might want to pick up on that. So this kind of double discourse, double discours, perhaps as the French might call it, mixed messaging that we get with the way the government is spinning Brexit and the way the media are able to portray it. There's a different thing being said, as you pointed out, here in Brussels with what is going on in the press in the UK. So I think that general media tabloid thing is something really important that comes out of the book. And I think you portray that really, really well. The other things that I wanted to hit on were, it's clear that the EU side were well prepared. Preparation was key. You talk about the time, which I remember thinking about it at the time, where the Minister for exiting the EU, David Davis, turns up without any notes, empty-handed, just for a chat. And it's clear as well that the EU side worked very, very hard on team building and trust and inclusion, respect. The fact that the European Union is able to muster 27 nation states and get them to agree on the outcome is a huge contrast to what is going back on in the UK, where one nation state's government cannot get its own cabinet to agree, its own government to agree, its own party to agree, its own House of Commons to agree. Quite stark contrasts in the way that Brexit is managed on both sides of the table. And it's clear that, the European Union negotiators worked very, very hard to keep all the actors within the EU in the loop. And there are a lot of actors to keep in the loop, but that seemed to be done pretty successfully. Transparency comes out in the book as well very clearly, that it was clear that Michel Barnier wanted to make the Brexit negotiations from an EU perspective as transparent as possible. And we have to say, that historically, the European Union hasn't always had a great reputation in terms of the way transparency has been interpreted around some of the institutions. But here it's the other way around. there seems to be a lack of transparency with regards to the way the UK government pitches its Brexit negotiations. So you talk in the book about EU stability versus UK volatility, and I think that's a completely valid way of looking at it. So this unity that appears on the side of the EU, I think, is to do with preparation, it's to do with trust, it's to do with transparency, and it manages to get the job done among the EU 27, which I think, you know, the British thought probably might not happen, and that there'll be all sorts of bilateral negotiations going on between big EU states, small EU states, and essentially, if the UK held out a little bit longer, things would work out just the way the UK wanted. But what was clear was that the European Union were very, very clear about the four freedoms and not erring from the four freedoms. 3.5 freedoms, I think it was called, when there was a conversation with Jeremy Corbyn. A larger point I'd like to make, and it saddens me a little bit, I'll be truthful, is that it's clear that the Brexit negotiations do underline that the British government was placing identity politics as more important than rational choice economic decisions. Now, the Conservative Party traditionally is renowned for the latter. You know, whatever you think of the Conservative Party, if you go back to Thatcher, the strength of the party was we represent the best economic interests of the country. And that's something that Labour, you know, would have to grapple with at elections. But that rational choice was not as important in the Brexit negotiations as the identity politics. Because otherwise, how else can we explain? How can we explain the decision not to go for a softer Brexit? Ultimately, the freedom of movement of people, with what the government perceived as the negative immigration aspect of that, was not a price worth paying to remain in the single market. And the take back control mantra, the identity politics mantra, was the predominant mantra of the negotiations. Now, we might look on it now and say, take back control. Yeah, actually, in terms of the UK borders, they've lost control of them post-Brexit in many ways, which is ironic. I've got a few other points I could make in the discussion, but I'll just make one more, which I really liked in the book, is that Stefan quite rightly acknowledges the tireless work of the civil servants and the negotiators, not just on the EU side, on the UK side, people who worked extremely hard to get this deal across the line when the sands were shifting politically, when the messages they were getting from their leaders were changing, giving up their holidays, working at weekends, working at late. So I was really pleased to see that you made a point of bigging up the behind the scenes people that helped the negotiations get across the line. There are things I could say about security, internal, external, Northern Ireland, the protocol, the internal market bill, but I'll shut up for now. Thank you.
We can take up those points. Can I, Stefan, thank you. Can I, because I'll give you now will have an opportunity to respond, but can I ask that question that Katrin raised about the, in a world of hard geopolitics, should the EU not have been more flexible? And I call that the Ivan Rogers, Annan Men and Jonathan Fall argument about strategic myopia. And I think it's one that constantly comes through, that the argument that really maybe these four freedoms were potentially divisible, but also that the prize should have been the strategic, in other words, foreign policy. So I think it's so important that if you wouldn't mind addressing it immediately.
Okay. Well, I address it in the book as well. And it's an easy point in the abstract to make, right? You need to be, geopolitics is important, we need alliances, and that's all true. And certainly with the UK, which is a very important security player and NATO country and United Nations Security Council veto and so on, G7. But what we're really talking about at heart is, can the EU weaken its own single market, its own basis for global power for the sake of some abstract work in terms of alliance with other geopolitical allies? And my answer to that is no. So and that was a political choice in my view from the 27 to say the single market is something which we will not compromise on. There was a bit of hangover from Cameron's settlement in that as well. We had given some concessions on free movement of people and it hasn't worked. And we need to close that door very firmly now, because before you know, other countries come with demands for exceptions on students or whatever, mobility of other categories of people and social security benefits. And for me, and that's then the positive side, it's only by having the single market integrity intact that we can construct a useful alliance with the UK and the US and other partners. Otherwise, we're just weaker and weaken ourselves. So of course, now we need to work. EU, NATO is now stronger than ever before because of Ukraine, and the UK plays an important role in NATO, obviously, and on the Ukraine crisis. But to weaken the single market for that purpose would have been self-destructive in my view. So that's my answer to that.
Just on that, because sometimes, like you said, that you think it's important enough to kind of like stick to all that, but at the same time, when it suited the EU, they also showed some sort of flexibility, when it comes to the green and red lanes, I think in Northern Ireland and so on. So there was some flexibility after all, when it kind of like suited the EU. So isn't that like a counter argument then to what you've just said?
No, I don't. I think there was no flexibility on the core principles. And within that mandate, as negotiators, then you know the sensitivities of the 27, then you do some give and take to try to construct a deal, which worked with Theresa May, which worked with Boris Johnson. But that gives you the flexibility to do that, as long as you stick to the core asks from the German Chancellor, the French President, the Dutch Minister-President, the Belgian Prime Minister, and so on and so on. And so in that context, there is some flexibility, but not on the core of what the EU is and the principle. And that was, I think, the big misunderstanding from the UK, that and the fact that by putting yourselves out of the club, you just reduce your political influence. And so, and that's my final point, and geopolitical EU, yes, and without the UK. And then we need to find other ways to bilaterally cooperate, EU-UK, or multilaterally in the United Nations and NATO and other fora, G7, G20.
Thank you. So now we'll open to the floor, and I start here. If you wouldn't mind saying who you are and who you want to address the question to. I'm assuming it's to all panel.
For Handelsblatt, a German newspaper. I was also based in London during the time, and now I'm based here. A question to Stefan, a bit broader than just the 4 freedoms. And do you think this deal is a great deal? I mean, or do you have any regrets?
We'll take a second question now, and then we go back to Stefan, and then I.
Great. My name's Sandra Kaduri. I'm Director of Keeping Channels Open, a new dialogue forum for UK, Europeans, and Americans. I just wanted to say now that there's some 59–60% of people in the UK would like to rejoin if they had the chance. Obviously, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and majorities in Wales as well now. Obviously, we've now left as the UK without a majority consent. now I don't necessarily see, and I'm asking whether the EU has issued any guidelines to other countries about democracy, about referenda and elections, because clearly this wasn't done in the right way. And I hold the EU kind of responsible a bit for that, for not challenging the way this was done in the first place. It's not democratic the way this was carried out. And I don't see the EU reacting and coming up to stop that happening elsewhere in future.
Yeah, is it a great deal? It's a deal. And that was also important. No, because we said, no, we said, as long as you have a deal, we can then also build on a deal situation as opposed to no deal. Is it a great deal in terms of trade? Well, for the EU, I think we got what we wanted. Zero tariff, zero quota, integrity of our single market, so border checks on incoming UK exports to us. All of that is there, so we have safeguarded our space for regulatory space, and that's was also a very important point. From the UK's perspective, clearly leaving the single market has a cost, and that's that the economy has to absorb that now. There is nothing on common foreign and security policy. That's a regret. We tried many times. Our member states even insisted we would table a full text, which we did after we told them Frost doesn't want it. So there's no point to insist on something and ask something. If you know the other party won't give it to you, then why ask something in the negotiation if you know you won't get it? But yeah, we tried everything really. So mobility, we wanted to do more for students, au pairs, school kids, different for few categories of people. We didn't get anything on that because the UK government didn't want to, at that point at least, said we don't want to treat EU nationals better than non-EU nationals. So we're not going to give any more specific favored treatment. So that's also something which we had wished to get. Erasmus at the very end, suddenly the plug was pulled. We were ready. Everything was ready. All the parameters, the money, the funding, it was all there. And in the last week, I think someone in Downing Street pulled, well, Boris Johnson pulled the plug, basically. Whatever happens in Downing Street was obviously under his watch. So on the article, no, that I disagree. Article 50 says a member state can notify its withdrawal according to its own constitutional procedure. And there was a huge debate in the UK. What is that procedure? Theresa May said, I can just send this letter. Gina Miller attacked that in front of the courts with an aptly named lawyer called Lord Panic at that particular time. So he defended Gina Miller's case, where he said, but the parliament has to vote on this, and that was the proper constitutional procedure. There was a referendum, but then parliament said, yes, we're going to do this. I think you can look back at this as a political mistake, perhaps from the parliament, because parliament did not have a discussion on what Brexit meant. Parliament just gave the vote and said to the UK government, send the letter and we'll have a ticking clock, and in 2 years we'll need a deal to get out. But I don't think you can expect from the EU, we can't expect more than what Article 50 says, that every member state has to respect its own constitutional procedures. And our Court of Justice has also ruled on that. So I think that's all very clear.
I think it's also fair to say that in relation to all treaty amendments in the EU, their subsequent ratification is down to the constitutional provisions of the member states. So the EU does not and will never interfere in the conduct of domestic politics. And the UK referendum was a UK referendum legislated for by Westminster. So the EU, if the EU in fact had in any way interfered, then there would have been cries of interference and undue pressure from London and from the UK. So the EU can't do what the EU treaties will not allow it to do. Well, no, I think well, I think that the spirit of a democratic process by definition is contested, but what is not contested are the constitutional and legal provisions of the member states. And that referendum was conducted within the law of the country that held the referendum. Whether or not you agree with how it was done is entirely domestic. It's not, the EU does not have a role. But anyway, I think we need to go on. I'm going to this side first and I'll come back to you. So please, and then Richard. and I'll come back
Hi,
over
thank
this
you very
side.
much. Philippe Lefebvre, European Defence Security Summit. I have a question about sort of other negotiations the EU is entering, especially on this case enlargement. What are some of the lessons the EU has learned from the Brexit negotiations? And I think that Nick, a lot of the points you raised here, and how do you think this will be expressed in the future? Or is this so sui generis, so unique, there's nothing really we can learn? Thank you.
And Richard.
Thank you. I'm Richard Corbett. I was the Labour Party leader in the European Parliament, so I followed all this with great interest. I was attending shadow cabinet, of course, throughout that period as leader. My question is on the sequencing. Article 50 says the withdrawal agreement shall be negotiated taking account of the future relationship between the EU and the country withdrawing. But in fact, the negotiations settled the divorce arrangements first, and the future relationship was negotiated afterwards. Would it not have been better, in hindsight, to have agreed first on what kind of future relationship, which would have perhaps made the negotiations on the withdrawal a little bit easier, not least because it would have forced the British side, and you mentioned the divisions, to actually define what it wanted before embarking on the negotiations. It wasn't just that the country was divided between Remainers and Brexiteers. The Brexiteers were divided sometimes quite bitterly about whether they wanted a close relationship, stay in the single market sort of thing, or close to aligned with it, or global Britain, as the other side put it, cut all relationships with Europe, even Erasmus, as it turned out in the end. There were two competing visions of Brexit. The government was divided on it, the parliament was divided on it, and nobody forced them to define what they wanted before embarking on the negotiations.
Perhaps on the lessons, well, maybe one of the other panelists want to come in. I'll take Richard's question first then. It's very interesting how you framed that, because I was thinking about various elements in the book. And one is at the end of part 1, where I described the end of sequencing. So withdrawal negotiations were over in general terms, citizens' rights had been defined, the financial settlement, so-called Brexit bill had been settled, or at least the terms for it, and some general outline, 3 possible solutions for Ireland, Northern Ireland. And then we came to that giving a transition. And in the book, I describe an episode where there was some panic in our team, where Angela Merkel on the plane from Berlin to Brussels suddenly said, well, Michel told me we will know what future Britain wants before we agree on a transition, so I'm not going to agree to this. And there was a whole panic because all the diplomats said, yeah, we're all fine. And so she was in that spirit of, we need to pin the UK down. We need to force the UK to decide what future it wants. I don't think the UK was ready, to be honest, at that particular point. And that then comes to the March European Council, where the biggest issue the UK lobbied for, the UK civil servants lobbied for, was the so-called evolution clause. Like, we can get a free trade agreement. Okay, people in the May's team told us that's fine, but as long as there is an evolution clause, we can move closer. But they were not ready, and the Chequers future relationship came 6 months later. The other thing I would say on sequencing, our worry was that the UK owed money to the EU, just like the EU owes money to the UK, but the UK was a net contributor, so that's of course an important point, 10 billion a year net. We were very worried that if we didn't do the sequencing, that money that the UK owed us would be used to buy a better future, perhaps to do something on the single market's integrity, and put pressure on member states to say, look, well, so we wanted to avoid that situation by all costs.
I also remember you were very insistent on that, right? Like to first settle the divorce before going there.
Yes, and Theresa May agreed ultimately. And in the book, I say partly why she agreed was that she was weak domestically in terms of, will this ever happen? This Brexit was still in the autumn 17 a big question. And once we had settled, and this then comes to the British media, I would say, there was so much in papers like Daily Telegraph and others on the Brexit bill, and we shouldn't pay, and other issues. And then when May finally agreed to all of that, the big headline splash was Freedom Day. Finally, we're there. So there's quite a bit of spin in there.
Yeah, I mean, it's clear the UK wasn't ready, but I don't think the UK probably would ever have been ready on this issue, to be honest, because the European Union has been driving a wedge through the Conservative Party since the Maastricht Treaty. It probably will continue to do so. I think one of David Cameron's rationale for having a referendum was to bring a stop to the end of the party divisions within the Conservative Party. That clearly didn't happen during the negotiation. So they wouldn't have been ready for that reason. I also think, and you allude to this in the book, Stefan, this kind of adversarial politics that we have in the UK with our Anglo-Saxon first past the post system, with just two parties kind of, you know, shouting across the floor in the House of Commons. There's no history of reaching out and making accords and coalitions with other partners. It's just not part of the UK political psyche. We tried it in 2010 with the Conservatives and the Lib Dems, and the Lib Dems haven't recovered from that brief spell of coalition. So the UK system isn't really set up to negotiate for those kind of things, I don't think. And then the third thing, if you add the British media to it, you know, the right-wing Eurosceptic press in the UK would have continued to push to try to get the deal to go in the direction that it wanted it to go in, which was a pretty hardcore Brexit interpretation. So I think for those three reasons, you know, if we'd waited for another year, 2 years, I still think we would have found you'd have been up against exactly the same divisions.
May I add something? Because I totally agree. I felt it was very interesting how the demands just got worse and worse, or like, you know, when it comes to Brexit, the hardliners got more powerful and powerful. And whenever there was, like, they agreed on something, they would come up with something even worse or like even harder, Brexit like. And I think like obviously always echoed by the tabloids. It was quite incredible. And I always think like that is for me, one of the most interesting things. I mean, Philip Hammond used to be a Eurosceptic in the Conservative Party. We keep forgetting that he ended up as like the most pro-Remainer and pro-EU person being bashed by the British media. And that's incredible when like this shift over only a few years. So I also agree that there would have never been sort of an agreement what Brexit means and where they want to go to.
So I think you're absolutely right. The UK is by and large not a referendum country. It's not practiced at using that instrument. But the one thing smart politicians do when they don't know what to do is they buy time. Smart politicians will always try to frame what has happened. And that didn't happen in the UK. And the obvious way to do it is you had direct democracy, a referendum. You create something within the parliament. You bring it back into representative democracy, a parliamentary commission, and you say this parliamentary commission will take evidence over the next 3 months. It will hear from ministers, from opposition, it will hear from experts to see whether or not it could have generated at least options or something, even the basis of a consensus. But if you don't buy time when you don't know what to do, you're simply walking into a mess. And they never got out of the mess. So I would have thought that it was, yes, the adversarial politics made this more difficult, but smart politicians always buy time when they don't know what to do. They never walk blindfold into a catastrophe. And that's what happened here. Can I just say something very briefly on lessons? So in one sense, no lessons, because this was the first negotiation in history where it was about two sides going further apart and not coming together. Enlargement is an entirely different process. It's about convergence with the EU from outside. But what it does teach the EU, I mean, there are very serious lessons for the UK, but the lesson for the EU is unity is a necessary but not sufficient condition, but without it, the EU finds it difficult to act collectively. The EU is strong if it can mobilize its institutional resources, and that was done very dramatically, I think, in this negotiation. And then I think the 9 pages of the first guidelines on the negotiations are one of the finest pieces of drafting I have ever seen. There's no ambiguity, there's no gobbledygook, there's no Euro speak. It is clear. And it was a really beautifully crafted document that anyone could understand. So I think there are lessons for the EU in terms of its public policy making from this. But we had someone here, you wanted to ask a question. We need you to take the mic, unfortunately, because it's live stream. Thank you.
I'm here in a personal capacity. I just wanted to go back on the realistic, Mathieu Capdevila. I just want to go back on the realistic expectation on the UK side on the outcome of the negotiations. Don't you think there are precedents with regard to the way in which the UK has been negotiated its special place in Europe, with the Thatcher rebate, with the Cameron special deal, where these were a very good deal for the UK, and I'm not quite sure how they were negotiated, but I regard the deal that was especially negotiated by Cameron as perfect for the UK and what it wanted, and the point it was. So don't you think there was some realistic expectations from the UK side to, no matter how the negotiation would be handled, they would get their way?
Sorry, can I just say this? I'm Louise Capdevila. I did history and politics, law. I'm a lawyer in London, and I specialised in trade. And I must say, I think we've just pissed on our own doorstep a little bit. And that is my view. And I think Brussels have negotiated really well because, we just wanted to get better and we weren't going to get better. So I think this is what Matthew actually wanted to say, and I just said it a bit more frankly.
Well, that was clear.
Nick Powell, we reporter, we probably none of us can follow that unimprovable analysis, but much was made on the Brexit on the British side about the fact that trade between the UK and the EU27, particularly in physical goods, was very much in the EU's favour, although completely missing the point that when you turned it into percentages, the economic hits were the other way around. Nevertheless, did that concern you at all? Did you basically simply think that's a hit we'll have to take? Or did you actually have the foresight to think, these guys will never get their act together, several years on, they'll still have completely failed to introduce checks and controls on goods coming into the UK from the EU, so nothing to worry about there.
Just on the clarity of the guidelines, I also compliment to the council officials who were involved in, who were responsible, and we helped them, but they were drafting those guidelines. So it's important to mention as well. I think on your question, well, Cameron also took the Conservative Party out of the EPP. Major's biggest achievement was opt-out in Maastricht, I think, in terms of his EU policy. Thatcher got a rebate, as you said. So there was, yeah, I think it was Xavier Bettel at some point said, no, they were half in, and now they want to be out and be half in. First they were in, but also a bit half out. So yeah. So I think what I would say, though, is that in 2020, Boris Johnson and David Frost more or less got what they wanted, except they had to accept what we wanted on fisheries and the level playing field. But they, on their main priority was to become sovereign. And in the book, I say, well, that was Brexit by definition. You didn't need to come to Brussels to negotiate with us to become sovereign because Brexit had happened by then. But in terms of trade, they didn't ask for all that much. But we still asked for the level playing field because any free trade agreement, as the guideline said, needed level playing field conditions. And on fisheries, of course, there was a give and take. We gave in a bit. And what we got, and that's important for the future, Frost was against it for quite a long time. It's very nerdy, but we're in Brussels, this overarching governance agreement, where we have one partnership council, one dispute settlement mechanism, or at least then it's some variations according to sector, but it's overarching. And we can plug in supplementing agreements. We have foreseen that in that overarching governance framework. Frost wanted salami sliced sectorial agreements, as they were called back then, the Swiss kind of model. The second question was on, zero tariff, zero quotas was the essence for us in terms of our ask. There were moments in 2020 when the UK said, well, if we can get rid of level playing field, we're willing to have tariffs. We said, no, that's a no-go for us. There's no time, but also it's not in our interest. And so we kept to the zero tariff, zero quota. I don't think we could foresee that the UK today would not be ready yet to impose checks and do the checks, because it's still in grace periods that are extended. And that gives a lot of time to EU businesses to adjust. For the moment, I think what I see, and I work for the Commission in Belgium now, there's inward investment coming into Belgium because of Brexit still. British companies establishing themselves here, opening distribution centers, logistics centers, a second establishment mainly, but so that negative hit continues on the UK economy. And the Dutch, there's someone here who wrote a report on that, the Belgians, they prepared a lot. So they were ready by 1st of January 21 for whatever was coming. And we worked a lot, and I personally worked a lot with employers associations to make sure their members, there were meetings like this with self-employed, not with me, but the associations organized meetings to talk them through what was coming, customs work and so on. And so by the time we came to the 1st of January 21, that was all ready. Yeah. Yes. It was a very good website.
Well, I think the irony is that apart from the United Kingdom, Ireland was the country most affected by Brexit. And at the beginning, the worries were both on the economy and on peace on the island of Ireland. But the economy was ready. The logistics, they were ready. So, and that was because it was within the control of the Irish government, whereas the border is a much more complex issue.
Hi, Mark Dempsey, now based in Brussels, but was based in London. Firstly, a comment, smart politics and smart leaders. The climate wasn't there, still isn't there. It would have taken what the leaders of the day to stand up to the media and the Brexiteers and the Conservative Party, and that just wasn't going to happen. My question is another kind of obvious one. How do you see the UK rejoining? So for example, Labour win the next election, they do well in the first term, come 5 to 7 years, a referendum is on the manifesto. Under what conditions could you see the EU putting the UK to rejoin? I think Gideon Rachman said this in the FT the other day, that this is how he foresees it. Thank you.
I'll take advantage now of the microphones over in this direction. My name is Jarek Sealer. I've been following the Brexit process on behalf of the government of Canada throughout at the diplomatic mission here. I would like to comment on a comment this gentleman made about the legacy of the méthode Barnier, because as much as it is a process of managing divergence, there are some important lessons. And I think, sorry, Nick, you had made that comment about the transparency. Most people think negotiations often take place, the real crux compromises behind closed doors, but I've never seen such extreme transparency used to great effect as the EU side during these negotiations. I think that's a really important lesson that we're seeing today in all of the various, we have a whole different atmosphere now with the war in Ukraine, and those lessons are still important, even if the basic dynamics are different. So I do think that's a really important point. My question would be about the influence of third countries that are affected by this process throughout. I'm thinking my own, but others, United States, Japan, others, who historically the United Kingdom has been the entry point into the single markets. Japanese investors and companies, the car companies, were very quite vocal on their concerns. Others were a bit more quiet behind. I think the UK government really felt that countries like the UK, we would have, new global free trade agreements with all these countries. At the same time, at a few key moments, the United States government was quite vocal in what it thought was important and needed to be done. And I'm thinking in particular on the Northern Ireland Protocol and the importance for the Good Friday Agreement. I just would be interested, how important was that? Because I think in a way it was a bit of a surprise for the Conservative government to hear that kind of messaging when they were thinking more of the opportunities rather than some of the hard reality that came from Washington. I'd just be curious if that was, how important was that actually? Thank you.
Well, maybe Nick or Katrin can take the rejoin question. But I would say to that the EU is evolving in the meantime. So now we use the peace facility to fund arms equipment, national arms delivery of equipment to Ukraine. Next generation EU, 800 billion borrowing capacity. So all of that is part of the EU acquis as we continue. And probably this is most likely to deepen. Pandemic, common purchase of vaccines, health emergency preparedness, all these kind of things are new instruments. So yeah, the EU is obviously evolving. That's an important point to keep in mind. There's some episodes in the book on Corbyn-Starmer discussions. So I think there's also, from what I see the debate today in the UK, of course, it's good that some voices say we want a closer relationship, but I don't think the EU will not come to the rescue to compensate for negative effects of Brexit, unless you can create a broader deal where everybody finds some gains, basically. On the third countries, I think, yeah, again, there is a few pages in the book on us going to America. At a time when people in the UK were talking about global Britain and the UK-US trade deal, the only message I got from that was, what's in it for us? Not, and the same for other third countries. Then the UK had to go to third countries. I won't name them, but we had free trade agreements, of course, with around 60 countries around the world. And some of these countries said, okay, UK, maybe we'll roll over the terms you have with the EU, but on cheese, we were squeezed already by the EU, so we don't have much left for you there in terms of export quota. And we want a review clause that we can look at this later to get some extra benefits for us. So that, yeah, that's also a reality of being alone as a trading partner in the world. That's what Global Britain stands for. But I think it's easier if you're 27 countries to negotiate trade deals, I would say. And that whole rhetoric that you had back then, like if we're alone, we're more flexible, we're more agile, we don't need to construct a mandate with 27 others. I don't think I have seen much benefits of that so far in terms of getting extra benefits from third countries.
I have some questions from the online audience.
Oh, perfect.
So like a couple. So one is, what role did English exceptionalism play in shaping the UK initial assumptions and expectations ahead of the negotiations? The second is also a comment. Thank you for the book, a really interesting read. One of the main narratives of the book is the contrast between the UK and EU approaches. The UK, disjointed, opaque, inconsistent, at times inflammatory. The EU, consistent, coherent, transparent, less emotional, and much more united. On the latter point, were there any points where you were concerned that the institutional unity in Brussels or the political unity among the MS was threatened?
Thank you. Nick, can I ask you on English exceptionalism?
You may. Could I just go back to the question about the Labour Party and the second term? There was an optimist in. I mean, we've got to get the Liberal Democrats even supporting the single market first. So we've got a long way to go before we get Labour talking about going back into the European Union. The thing to bear in mind is that in many ways, the UK had what we might call a rather sweet deal as member of the European Union. You know, we had our own pretty vibrant currency, sterling. We had the freedom of movement. But we weren't part of Schengen. And if the UK was to go back into the EU, assuming that there, was an appetite for that, and, I think we're a long way from that being the case, Would the terms be the same terms that we had before? Pretty unlikely. I think we'd be signing up for the, bolts and braces, full membership of the EU. So look, I don't think it's going to happen in the short run. I think the other problem that we face in the UK is this knowledge gap, which makes the British public rather easy to persuade one way or the other. We don't teach about the European Union in British schools. If you're doing a geography A-level, you might come across it, but it won't be part of a kind of citizenship education like it is in Germany. And when you see polls the week before the Brexit referendum, where it says that up to 1/3 of the electorate hasn't made their mind up which way they're going to vote, that kind of sends alarm bells ringing a little bit. So even if we did get ourselves up that mountain and in a position for there to be a second referendum, it's quite easy that with a campaign that was kind of driven, as we saw the previous campaign, that a 10%, 15% lead could quite easily evaporate. I don't wish to be too pessimistic about it, but having kind of followed the whole European debate in the UK for almost 30 years now, much as I would be very supportive of the UK rejoining. Oh, lucky you. But yeah, English exceptionalism. Well, I think, look, one of the reasons why the UK is the UK is we are an island, which makes us a little bit different. I know Ireland is an island, but we're an island which kind of is Anglophone. We have this so-called special relationship with the US. We have a history of empire. We were never invaded in the Second World War. We were on the victorious side. All of that kind of historical resonance, I think, has given us this kind of notion of English exceptionalism that now we bat above the weight that we are. This kind of notion of global Britain, which I'm sure was couched as part of the Brexit negotiations, isn't really a reality, I think, as we found out, subsequently. So English exceptionalism is very much part of the historical narrative with regard to Euroscepticism. And I'm sure it will continue to frame Britain's attitude towards the European Union. And that exceptionalism is what you kind of see in some of the kind of tabloid rhetoric around the European Union. So I don't know too much about how English exceptionalism played out in the actual negotiations, but I'm sure Stefan can probably elaborate on that question.
Well, I'll take the question on risks for unity, I guess, was the second question. And it made me think also, the point you made, that the person who put the question in the chat said, well, it was much more emotional on the UK side, and that's, of course, quite natural. For the UK, this was a huge political challenge. For us, it was also political, but to some extent also managerial, and that's where some criticisms would then come in. But I think, by and large, it was a political process whereby we, when it comes to the question on the art of negotiations, kept our principles all the time involved. In a way, we were the agent of 27 principles, the negotiation team. So whenever there was a new government, Barnier would go see the prime minister. He would talk to the parliament. He would talk to the local business community, talk them through. I myself went to lots of capitals to talk to business. We ran a network of think tankers where we basically said, this is deep, deep Chatham House. We're going to tell you everything. And so you're influential in your national debates. And this worked brilliantly well as well to our advantage, I think. Now, were there risks to unity? Yes, in the beginning there, definitely. And another one that I describe in the book is when we then went to the future relationship, because sequencing was also a factor of unity, I would say, to Richard's earlier question, because we focused on issues that united all the 27. I'm not going to pay more, I'm going to get less money. And the citizens' rights, of course, everybody was in agreement. Then we moved to the future, and we had some discussions in February, March with diplomats. where you could see things starting to pop up. Financial services, there's agricultural exports, trade and services more generally, or security cooperation, which was all legitimate. And so Barnier went to the March 2018 Council expecting perhaps a difficult discussion, and it was quite remarkable how EU leaders said, well, we all have our interests, but our unity is more important. So that sense of political responsibility from leaders to keep that unity was absolutely crucial. And that goes then beyond what we did as a negotiation team. That's really a political choice by the 27 prime ministers, presidents, chancellors, and so on.
But I mean, you also mentioned that in the book. I found that quite interesting because till the very last day, a lot of British people were still believing that the car sellers and the Prosecco makers and so on from Italy and Germany, whatever, would step in and save Britain, which I think was like very much showing the naivety you were mentioning before. And may I just add one thing to the exceptionalism, because I think it's very much linked to a nostalgia in Britain. So there was so much nostalgia about the old, times and the power Britain used to have. Very interesting. And like they kind of, it was almost like a bit, you saw on television all of a sudden the old shows and politicians talked about Dunkirk. And I do think, like, when I spoke to some people, they were like, well, and they had a point, I think, with that. They were always on the right side of history in a way for a very long time, whereas other, countries in Europe sort of experienced revolutions and breakdown of their system and so on, and Britain literally always came out on the right side. And I think that was then, or that led to basically Brexit in some ways too.
Can I ask another question about British exceptionalism? And that is, it would have been easier for almost any other country to leave the EU than the United Kingdom because of the Irish question. And right through the 19th century, British politics was bedeviled by something called the Irish question, prime minister after prime minister. And the Irish question never quite disappeared from British politics. But then, well, of course, but then the United Kingdom decides to leave, but a majority within Northern Ireland wanted to remain. But also then there was the complication of the Good Friday Agreement. So was it very tough for London to grapple with the Irish dimension of Brexit? How difficult was it for May and for Johnson?
May was incredibly consistent in saying we absolutely need to avoid that hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. To her credit, she always focused on that goal, to the point that she, I think, annoyed some of her cabinet members with that position. David Davis said after he had resigned that she had elevated Northern Ireland to canonical status as an issue. And I think it reflects what the UK in a Changing Europe, a think tank in London at some point had a survey, but how Conservative MPs saw the issue, and many of them thought it was something that the EU had invented basically as for the negotiation, which of course is, yeah. So it was really underestimated as an issue, I think, from the start.
I mean, hardly anyone has ever been to Northern Ireland, from these people, and that's quite interesting. Because I made this anecdotal, that might be a bit anecdotal, but whoever I've always met, like of MPs or normal British people, I always ask if they've been to Northern Ireland, and I would say 90% have never been there. And I think that is part of the problem then at the end of the day. And by the way, including the media.
And that of course didn't help that during the whole negotiations there was no Northern Irish executive to give a voice to London on, how they saw the situation or how the executive saw that situation.
And it has really disturbed territorial politics within the UK, with both Scotland and Northern Ireland. And the irony is that Brexit has proven a bigger test of the integrity of the United Kingdom than the integrity of the European Union. And one would not have predicted that prior to the referendum. Can I ask, are there any further? Please.
Yeah, my name is Colin Carroll. I'm just here in a personal capacity. So just to follow up on the point about Northern Ireland and the current protocol, obviously the unionist community feels a little bit betrayed by this. So many people of the unionist community. I'm just wondering, while you were negotiating this, were you taking into account the effect that would have on the stability of Northern Ireland? That, okay, it's an outcome which a lot of people wanted, but a significant community of Northern Ireland didn't want.
We met with Northern Irish politicians at various occasions. As I said earlier, there was no Northern Irish executive, so that was a bit unfortunate in that sense, that you listen to one or the other parties and trying to, to work with all those parties. But of course, the prime responsibility to work with these parties was with the UK government. And so how that worked in London, I can't comment on that, or how the London-Belfast relationship was there. From our side, we, of course, worked very closely with the Irish government, and our bottom line was the integrity of the single market, and then for the Irish and the UK signatories to the Good Friday Agreement, the protection of that agreement.
I mean, there was no outcome in relation to Northern Ireland that would not have disturbed the balances within Northern Ireland. And on the island of Ireland, I don't think it's just within Northern Ireland, because it's also opened up the question potential of Irish unification in a way that wasn't on the table heretofore, the unintended consequence. If there are no further questions, then I'm going to ask each of the panelists if they want one final. Oh, okay.
Maybe one final question on the role of civil society in the UK in shaping the negotiations. Maybe that's a personal point of view, but I found the British society quite in a state of apathy, more or less, when it comes to having a point or having a view on how the negotiations should be led. What's your am I right in saying so, or what? I think the constitutional trial was mentioned. What's your view on maybe the relative state of apathy of civil society in the negotiations? Yeah.
I'm not going to answer your question, but I'm going to think more about the referendum campaign itself, which may be kind of, we could draw some conclusions about what's happened since Brexit. But it's clear that the Remain side built a kind of monosyllabic case around kind of rational choice economics, and that voting to stay in the EU was about the economic argument only, really. That was the one that was featured during the campaign. We didn't see anything trying to make a deeper psychological connection with the European Union, whereas all the Brexit campaign was about the kind of deeper psychological connection of sovereignty and national identity. So I think the Remain campaign got that wrong. And I know there were aspects of the Remain campaign that tried to push on some of the social agenda and the security agenda, but it did become the whole thing became exceptionally one-dimensional on both sides. You had the Remain campaign, which was pushing, well, just sort of saying, look, yeah, we know the EU, yeah, we don't know much about it, it's a long way away, but we're doing okay economically, so probably just best to vote yes. That was kind of what the Remain campaign was in one sentence. And the Brexit campaign became very focused on sovereignty with a strong leaning towards migration. And you take those two side by side and you think on the back of an economic crisis that the EU actually handled pretty well, yeah, the first major test for the Eurozone. And, there's no rush to go back to the lira or the French franc, and even the radical right parties in France and Italy are not talking now about going back to that. But when you look back to the referendum, you can see that it really became a very kind of bipolar campaign around vote yes, because it's good economically, despite the economic problems we've had, vote no, because you'll take back control, you'll have much more money for the health service, all this kind of thing, and we'll regain our sovereignty. I mean, it was a poor campaign, and I think Labour should take some responsibility for that as well.
Or I might, because like we ask that question very often to all sorts of companies and like, for example, the car industry, and they just decided to not really be vocal because half of the country, half of their customers have voted Brexit, half of their staff voted Brexit. They just didn't want to get involved really. And they regretted quite a lot, I think, that they weren't more vocal about it. But like that was the explanation for quite a long time, that they just wanted to keep out of politics, although they were basically in the center of it.
That's what they came to see us, and you could feel they couldn't speak truth to power in the UK, I would say, if I put it like that. The business community, they were hesitant to tell things to the government, not to destroy potentially good relationship with the government. But that's all water under the bridge now.
It is indeed. Well, I think we have we've come to the end of the formal part of this evening's seminar on Stefan's book, and I think there will be a glass of wine to continue the discussion afterwards. And can I commend to you this book, Inside the Deal, How the EU Got Brexit Done. And while I'm in the chair, I'll abuse it to say that there will be a companion book coming out in April. An academic book that it's already with the publishers on, it's called The EU's Response to Brexit, United and Effective, with I'm one of the authors with a co-author. And in fact, reading, because we interviewed Stefan as part of our research, but reading the book, we're basically on the same, it's the same analysis, that the EU really was very effective in this. And I think there's a deeper, I think that the experience of the Brexit negotiation was an episode in which the EU exercised, but understood it exercised collective power. And I think that lasted through the pandemic and is still lasting through Ukraine. And there was a step change in how the EU handled crises pre-16 and post-16. And we need to pay much more attention to the EU that has emerged from all of this. And the mobilization of the institutional capacity, of the political responsibility, the unity, all of that was, it stress tested the EU system. And I think the EU has emerged from it as a more robust polity, with a stronger sense of its own collective power. As you mentioned, all the new instruments, the new EU that we see. And it's not that the EU isn't challenged. The EU is destined to be challenged and destined to disappoint, but it's a much more robust polity than the sort of reading of the EU as a polity that can't deal with existential threats. It's proven that it can. And so I think that's, this is a first cut at history, and the historians in 20 years' time will take a look at the documents. But can I thank the panel? That was a very engaging discussion of the book. Thanks, Stefan, as the author, and all of you for your very active engagement with the theme and the topic. And Brexit is not done. And so we'll come back and probably in 5 years' time, take a look again. So thank you all very much. And I think there's a glass of wine awaiting.